Hi, it's Professor Gould, and in this lecture, we're going to start talking about the cell. And we're going to start off just with, what is a cell? Well, as you learned in the Introduction to Biology lecture, a cell is the most basic unit of life. All living things are made up of cells. Sorry, viruses, you don't have cells, you're not alive. The cell is a fairly complex structure. It has an ability to do a bunch of different things. We're going to learn about a lot of those today. And different cells have different functions and therefore different shapes or forms. So on the left, we have some cells in the respiratory system. Each of these dark ovals is the nucleus of a different cell. So each of those dark ovals represents a different cell. So these are tall, thin cells that line the respiratory system. Red blood cells, on the other hand, are really small, they're round, and they kind of look see-through because, oddly enough, they don't have a nucleus. They actually got made from a cell that had a nucleus, then they ditched their nucleus and they just run around carrying oxygen for about 4 months before they die and get recycled by your body. Weird, right? There is something called a cell theory, and remember that a scientific theory is a broad statement that has been supported by research from lots of different areas. So cell theory states that the cell is the most basic unit of life, all living things are made of one or more cells, and all cells come from existing cells. So this diagram here shows the process of mitosis, which you probably learned about at some point in your educational history, where we start with one cell and we end up with two cells that are genetically identical to the first cell. They have the same exact chromosomes. This is the process that happens in cells like ours, which are called eukaryotic cells. That's how new cells arise. So there are commonalities to all cells, regardless of whether it's an animal cell or a plant cell or a bacterial cell. All cells are going to have a membrane around the outside that we call either the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. That's made of fat molecules, and it separates the inside of the cell from the environment outside of the cell so that the cell can have different amounts of salts and sugars and proteins and all sorts of things inside than there is outside the cell. So that's the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. Please note, this is not a wall. A cell wall is a very different thing, a completely different structure. So make sure you call it a membrane. All cells have DNA that carries the instructions for making the cell and everything in the cell. And in the human body, all cells, okay, except for your red blood cells, have DNA that carries the instruction for making every cell in your body. That always blows my mind a little bit. Like the cells in your pancreas have all the DNA, all the instructions for making cells in your eye. Those instructions are turned off because the pancreas isn't gonna make eye stuff, but they have the DNA for it. That's just always been wild to me. All cells have ribosomes. Ribosomes are little structures that make proteins inside the cells. And all cells have proteins, which are molecules that build structures within the cells, and they can also act as signals and all kinds of different things. We'll talk a bunch about proteins. All cells are going to have all of these things. Now, there are two kinds of cells in nature. The most basic type is called a prokaryotic cell. There are two groups, domain bacteria and domain archaea. Bacteria you've obviously heard of, archaea you probably haven't. They're rarer and we haven't studied them as much. So we don't know as much about them. Don't worry about them for this class. Just know that there's another kind of organism that's sort of like bacteria, but not. Prokaryotic cells do not have what we call organelles, which are membrane-bound structures inside the cell. So they have a membrane around the cell, a cell membrane, but there's not another thing inside with a membrane around it. The next kind of cell, eukaryotic cells, do have those. Prokaryotic cells do have lots of stuff inside that are called inclusions. including ribosomes. Ribosomes and proteins are inclusions. The first form of life on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago was a cell that was a prokaryotic cell, very similar to the bacteria that are on Earth today. But the bacteria today have been evolving, are the products of 3.5 billion years of evolution. So they're not exactly the same. Prokaryotic cells are also really, really tiny. They are less than 1 micrometer in diameter. That is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Now, the other type of cell is called a eukaryotic cell, and everything else on Earth is eukaryotic. All the animals, the plants, the fungi, and things called protists, like the malaria parasite is an example of a protist. Amoeba are protists. All of these things are eukaryotic cells. And the difference between them is that they have membrane-bound structures inside the cell. And that's where these names come from. Eu means true, and karyo means nucleus. So eukaryotic means it has a true nucleus. Pro means before. And so prokaryotic means doesn't have a nucleus. It came before the nucleus. So not only do these eukaryotic cells have nuclei, they have other things like mitochondria and a bunch of other organelles that we're going to learn about today. They also have inclusions like ribosomes. They did not appear until about 1.2 billion years ago. So all life on Earth was bacteria and archaea for about 2.3-ish billion years, which is kind of amazing. The other thing about eukaryotic cells is that they are 10 to 100 times bigger than prokaryotic cells. They're still really small, but they are much, much, much bigger than bacterial cells. If we want to look at a prokaryotic cell, it looks something like this. The DNA is a single chromosome, and that chromosome is actually a circle. It's bundled up into a blob inside the cell that's called a nucleoid. Now, oid means kind of, or sort of, or not really. So just like a humanoid alien would be an alien that vaguely looks like a human but is not a human, a nucleoid kind of looks dark in the cell like a nucleus, but it's not a nucleus. It doesn't have a membrane around it. So that's why it's a nucleoid. Bacterial cells have a cell membrane or a plasma membrane. They have a cell wall around that, which is a tough layer that protects the cell, even in addition to the plasma membrane. And then some of them have a capsule, which is another layer that offers more protection. Some of them have little pili, which are these little spiky things that help the cell connect to other things, other cells or structures. And then some have a little tail called a flagellum that they can whip to move through fluid. But all of them are going to have the DNA in one chromosome that we call a nucleoid. They're going to have a plasma membrane and a cell wall. Now, animal cells, you are an animal, so these are the cells we're going to talk about this semester. They do not have a cell wall. They have DNA in multiple strands, which they're still called chromosomes, but rather than being one circular chromosome, we have a bunch of different linear chromosomes. And different types of organisms have different numbers of chromosomes. You have 46 in each of your cells. Animal cells don't have a cell wall. They don't have a capsule. They may have projections. They may have a flagellum or other projections. We'll talk some about that at the end of this lecture. And notice that they also have a bunch of structures inside the cell that are surrounded by a membrane. So we're going to get to know all of these structures as we go through these lectures. Now, I just want to show you very quickly the plant cell. We are not going to deal with plant cells this semester, but I just want to show you that the plant cell is eukaryotic. It has a true nucleus. It has a bunch of the other structures that animal cells have. It also has a cell wall. It's the same function as a bacterial cell wall, but a different structure. They have chloroplasts, so they can do photosynthesis. I am very jealous that humans can't do photosynthesis. I think that would have been a really cool thing to be able to do. And plants have a central vacuole that they just fill with fluid so that they can maintain the shape of their cells. Our cells don't do that. They don't have to stand up by themselves because we have an internal skeleton. I do want you to take a moment to look at this page, this link, so that you can see the comparison between the sizes of cells, molecules, and other structures within the cells. Because it's going to really help for you to visualize that. I can probably actually just do that, can't I? Let's see, can I follow this link? Let's hope it works. Okay, so here it is. So here is a coffee bean, a grain of rice, a little sesame seed, and you can see that here we have the measurements for these things. So a coffee bean is about 12 by 8 millimeters. Now, as we get smaller, we can see a grain of salt about 0.5 millimeter across. And then we're going to get to two different things that are protists. These are eukaryotic cells. Again, they have all the membrane-bound organelles. Amoeba proteus is kind of a big protist. Paramecium, kind of big again. Human eggs, very large human cell. They are a really large cell, much bigger than a sperm cell. So, sorry, this is the egg here. This is the sperm here. It is so much smaller. All it has to do is deliver the nucleus. The egg has all the other cellular stuff, all the cytoplasm, all the organelles. Those are going to come from the egg, not the sperm. Then we have some other human cells. We have a photoreceptor. That's the thing in your eye that responds to light. We have your skin cells. Here's your little tiny red blood cell. You can see it is really, really small. And then we see chromosomes, which are, again, going to be inside the cell. Now, this one looks really big compared to this red blood cell, but this is not as compressed as the chromosomes can be. So they do obviously fit inside cells. Then we look at, here's Baker's yeast. That's actually a single-celled fungus. So here's a yeast cell. And then we get much, much smaller. And now we are finally to the size of bacterium. Now notice that a mitochondrion is about the same size and shape as this kind of bacterium. Bacterium come in some other sizes, but this one is about the same size and shape as a mitochondrion. And that's one of the things that suggests that mitochondria might have started out as free-living organisms that then were engulfed by another free-living but predatory bacterium and engulfed by it and then not killed. And then the two things started living together in symbiosis. That's how we think eukaryotic cells came around. Other organelles, there's a lysosome that's also in your cells. And then we're going to get to viruses. So notice how much smaller viruses are than bacteria and then eukaryotic cells. Here's the measles virus, there's the flu, there's HIV, hepatitis, rhinovirus causes the common cold. This is something called a phage or a bacteriophage. It is specifically a virus that attacks bacteria. So they're also very, very small. And then if we keep going smaller, 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 we get to ribosomes, which are structures that are really important in cells because they make proteins. That's definitely a fact you need to have on the tip of your tongue all semester. And then we start going to protein molecules. So when we talk about protein molecules, this is how small they are. They are absolutely minuscule because there are a lot of them inside even the smallest cell, okay? And then as we go smaller, 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 we get to the phospholipid molecules. These are the ones that are going to make up the cell membrane and the membranes around organelles. And then we see a glucose molecule, a water molecule, and a carbon atom. These are so much smaller. These make up these larger molecules, like these two, methionine and adenine, and these protein molecules, which are part of cells. Well, let's get back to cells. eukaryotic cells, prokaryotic cells, and then eukaryotic cells. Isn't that kind of fun? And then you have multicellular things, which are the coffee bean and the rice and the sesame seed. How was that? Kind of fun, right? Okay, in the next section, we will talk about the cytoplasm, which is most of the inside of the cell.